Do I know you? Wait, I know you. You're that landlord that never raises the rent on his tenants. I think they refer to you as Mr. Nice Guy. My name is Chatto, and I've been a landlord for over 25 years, and I wanted to share with you the thought process that I go through when deciding about annual rent increases. So that being said, let's have a quick chat with Chatto regarding the pros and the cons of raising rent annually on your tenants. So we're going to start off with a quick story time. I'm actively looking for deals. I'm actively promoting to find sellers that want to sell their property. And I spoke to a landlord just recently. And I'm talking to her about her property. And properties seems to be in great condition. She's actually owned it a long time. She did some renovations actually 2 years ago. New kitchen, new bath. The place is well taken care of. And she's really taken care of the place the time she's owned it as a landlord. And she has a long-term tenant in place that's subsidized, so they pay rent like clockwork. The government pays the rent, right? I'm like, okay, cool. So then I ask her the important question, how much is the rent that you're charging this tenant? What is the rent amount? And she comes back and she says, well, that's the problem. The rent is only $690 a month. And $690 a month? Wow. Now, this was a 2-bedroom house, which in my market probably would go for at least $1,800 minimum. So she is almost a third of the actual rent that this property would be getting in today's market. So stack on top of that this particular market is rent controlled, and stack on top of it that this particular market, you're really not able to get rid of a tenant if they are paying their rent and they're paying it on time. So with those two things, I'm really not only buying that house, I'm buying that tenant as well. So the reason I'm saying is she never raised her rent. She was being Mrs. Nice Lady, and she hasn't raised her rent, and she's taking care of the property. And now, 30 years later, when she's ready to sell that property and she's tired of being a landlord, that property is probably worth a third of any other property on the market because I am buying the tenant as well as buying the property. So, and obviously she doesn't want to hear that yet, and she thinks her property's worth triple what I'm willing to offer her for it. And that's okay, right? We can shake hands and part friends, but it really kind of leads to the conversation of how important it is to keep on top of your rent increases and not just like be Mr. Nice Guy. No increase, no increase, no increase. So, as I said, my particular market has certain rules, and your market probably has a lot of rules too. So you want to find out what your state and local rules are. Is there a certain amount that you can raise it? Is there a certain amount that you need to keep it under? How often can you raise it? Are there any types of legal rules? So you get with your legal counsel, you figure that out. But that being said, it's important to know, because if you are in an environment that is rent controlled, that puts you more likely to be in a position where when those annual increases come up and you've had tenants that have been there for a while, chances are they're below market. For example, this particular property, I'm going to talk about a 2-bedroom in my market, probably goes for about $1,900 right now. So if I've had that property for 10 years and I'm only allowed to do 4% increases, and I've done that max 4% increase for the past X amount of years, chances are they're probably paying $1,500 a month, and they're a couple $100 below market. And in that case, it's a pretty simple decision, right? You need to raise it the max amount, the 4% that you can, and you're still giving them a property way below market. And that's like a kind of an easy one to figure out. The question more becomes like, okay, you're in a market that is not rent controlled, and you can, right? So you can have a property where a tenant's paying $1,200 a month, the market's $1,800. Now, I'm definitely not going to suggest you take that person to $1,200 a month and say, hey, your new rent is $1,800. That's not right. You're not taking care of people, and you're probably going to be losing a tenant. Even if they really don't have anywhere else to go, and if they do stay, they're probably going to be upset if you raised it from $1,200 to $1,800. It's just like, that's not the right thing to do. And that's kind of obvious. But also, right, you need to kind of find the sweet spot and figure out what you can do. Now, you're not going to be in that situation unless you've probably picked up a new property and had a tenant in place that was below market. So we've had situations where we've purchased properties from landlords and it was way below market. And what we've done is we kind of go to that tenant after we take ownership and we say, hey, you have this property you're in. It's a 2-bedroom property. It's a nice house, and you're paying $800 a month in rent, and the going market rate is, at the time I think it was like $1,200 or $1,300, whatever the case may be. And you have a conversation with, hey, this is the market rent. This is where you're at. I don't want to raise your rent up to market, right? That's a huge jump, and I don't want to do that to you. But I also, need it to be a little bit more equitable, a little bit more fair. What do you think would be a fair rent amount for me to renew it at? And put it on them, because sometimes you might be surprised where they come back, and where they hit. Obviously losing a tenant, right? So the pros, so one of the pros of raising rent is like keeping up with the market value, but one of the cons is you could potentially lose a tenant. Now, at the end of the day, if the market rent has become a lot higher, the chances of that are smaller. If what they're paying and what you're asking them to pay is still well below anything else they're going to find, you're less likely to lose that tenant. Might be some animosity. That might be another con. Like there might be some animosity there if you go and raise the rent unilaterally, extremely big jump. Those big jumps are not good. That's why it's important. Like, so it's one of the pros of raising rent is if you're constantly just raising it a little bit, you're keeping them on pace. I was speaking with a landlord the other day, and he had not raised the rent in forever because they were good tenants, because they couldn't afford it. And now he's in a situation where they can't afford the rent the low rent that they're paying. And he's contemplating, I got to go through eviction, et cetera, et cetera. And now he's in a situation where the rent is extremely low, right? He can only raise it so much. And, right, if he ends up evicting these people, now they're getting forced into that situation where their rent is going from, let's say, $1,000 to $1,600, right? Because he never raised the rent in between. And it really provides, it's a little bit counterintuitive, but it's almost like a disservice to put somebody in a situation where they're going to have to go from paying almost, a small amount of money for rent to a huge amount of money for rent, whether or not it's with you or someone else. And you don't want to put people in that position. So that's another great reason that you kind of want to keep people at market rent. Now, a lot of times, right, if you have a newer tenant and they've been there a year, they're probably at market rent, right? So normally if somebody's pretty close to market rent and they've been there a year, that first year, we're probably not going to raise the rent. We're probably going to renew it at another year at the same price. Right? Because it's also important to keep tenants. And also you got to watch as the market starts to shift and become harder to get tenants, right? Because it does happen, right? Rents don't just go up, they do go down sometimes. And you need to kind of keep abreast of that. We actually have somebody coming up for a renewal now. And while they are at market rent, the rents are definitely softening. And we do not want to lose a tenant in that property at this point. So we actually offered them a reduction in rent, probably close to 10%, which is still unfortunately more than they want to pay. So we'll see where it goes. But like sometimes it might be a good idea to do that depending on the market. If it was the same situation a year and a half ago, we wouldn't have rushed to potentially lower the rent because we knew we could get another tenant like that, and that new tenant would probably be paying more than the current tenant. So that's just another thing to keep in mind. You need to know, is your market, talk to other landlords, right? Especially that's another reason to get in a real estate investor association. There are a lot of times you can talk to other landlords and, hey, do you have a lot of vacancies right now? Are you having trouble finding tenants, right? And having those conversations with people kind of helps you keep a pulse on the market. The other thing, like I said, is it's going to affect your resale value. So lower rents decrease what your property's worth if you're looking at it from an investment standpoint. Again, if you're looking to keep it long term, that's okay. But you're definitely going to get caught, right? Because you as a landlord, right, you want to provide a good service. You want to make sure that if something happens, you're able to fix it quickly. You're able to improve the property. You're able to take care of the property. And in order to do that, you need to keep up with the rents. Because like I said, everything just keeps going up in value. So there are a lot of pros to, I wouldn't even say raising rent, is keeping rent as close to market as possible and being in line with the market. You will, be more likely to lose a tenant over a rent increase if the market if there's a lot of things on the market for them to be able to go out and rent, right? So you're more likely to lose a tenant in that case, which is why the smaller increases over a longer period of time are much better than the big increases over the big increase jump. So you're better to take a tenant and raise the rent every year for 10 years than you are to wait 5 to 7 years and then have this big jump, because that's going to give you more likely to lose a tenant. Because tenants, right, they're smart. They're going to do math. They're going to say, okay, rent's going up $25 or whatever the case may be. And they compare that to what it costs to find another place, to come up with another security deposit, to rent a truck, to get their friends to move, all the costs associated with moving, everything involved with that. You're a lot less likely to lose a tenant over a $25 to $50 a month increase, depending on where your rents are, right, than you are when you wait, and then do a huge jump, and it's a big shock to them. But you definitely want to keep that. That's a potential con, is losing a tenant, having a vacancy, doing a turnover, paying to get a new tenant, like all the stuff associated with that. The other thing you want to consider is sometimes it may or may not be a timing issue for the tenant. It may or may not be a timing issue. The tenant may be going through something at the time and barely scraping by. And if that's the case, and the tenant says, hey, I can't afford the rent as it is, you got to make a judgment call, but you don't want to necessarily renew it for another year at the same rent amount. But you may want to say, hey, you know what? I'll give you another 6 months to get through whatever this financial hardship is, to get like whatever it might be, and then do an increase then after 6 months, with the following increase 6 months later, a year later, whatever the case may be. But you do need to keep in mind timing challenges. You also want to keep in mind when leases end. Leases that end in December, January, February are a lot harder to turn over than leases that turn over in the summer, turn over in the springtime, right? It's a lot easier to, depending on the market, like you kind of got to, again, know your market to determine the best time to get tenants, and that would be the best time to have your leases end. So that's another piece of it. So overall, I guess the overarching theme of this entire video is you need to keep on top of your rents, and you need to keep them as close to market as possible, and potentially a little bit under market if you want to be competitive, in order to provide that great place for the people to live. So without further ado, I've been blabbering on about rent increases for the last 13 minutes. Hopefully it was of value to you. If so, like and subscribe because of the algorithm and all that cool stuff. And I hope you enjoyed another episode of Chat with Chatto. Have a great day.